We've been talking about Brexit the past few days, but there's something that probably did not get your attention last year when this bill was filed, because the purpose was to bring the United States out of the United Nations. Who in the world would be crazy enough to offer a piece of legislation like this? Well, none other than our good friend from my former home state of Kentucky, Thomas Massie, Congressman out of Kentucky. Welcome, sir.
Hey, Vince, thanks for having me on. We call this Amexit, A-M-E-X-I-T.
Exactly. I love it. I love it.
And this is not in response to the Brexit, because we introduced this bill, as you pointed out, a year ago. And, who would be crazy enough to introduce it? Well, who would be crazy enough to stay in the United Nations and pay the majority of their funding while it's attended by third world dictators who are writing rules and regulations that are supposed to bind our country? That's what I want to ask.
That's an excellent question, and I mean, it's very obvious we're not the crazy ones. We're the ones who are thinking sensibly here. Tell us, what are the major reasons that you would articulate as to why we should withdraw from the United Nations?
Well, first of all, shout out to my friend there in South Carolina, Jeff Duncan, who is also, I would say, brave enough, not crazy, but brave enough to co-sponsor this legislation as I did. He's a great conservative, and I think he's on top of these things a lot more than the other guys in Congress. But just to give you my reasons why it makes sense for us to withdraw from the United Nations, first of all, there are 193 members of the United Nations. Over half of them are not free countries. Let me give you a list of some of them: North Korea, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Cuba, Venezuela, and Stalin was a founding member of the United Nations.
Wonderful.
If you think about it. And, people talk about, well, we need to stay on it because we've got the special position. We've got veto power because we're one of the permanent 5 nations. Well, guess what? So's China and Russia. Now, ostensibly, this organization exists to keep us from going to war. I would say they failed at that. If anything, it's nuclear weapons and the desire not to blow ourselves up that's kept us from going to war. Yet we keep getting in all these small world wars around the country, around the globe. The other thing is they say, they're going to promote human rights. But look at the membership of this organization. How in the heck are you going to promote human rights when these are the members? And when China and Russia have veto power over, any resolution that comes out of the United Nations, of course they're going to stick up for their third world dictatorships that they've allied themselves with. So it really doesn't have a good track record of sticking up for human rights when you've got some of the biggest abusers of human rights as members in the United Nations. Now, to add insult to injury, we pay probably about $8 billion a year to the United Nations. We are the biggest funder of the United Nations from the United States. And finally, the thing that concerns me the most here recently is they promoted laws, a treaty, an international treaty they're pushing to curb small arms trafficking. Now, think about this, Vince. If the United Nations is populated with third world dictators, what interest do they have in civilians owning firearms? I'll tell you, absolutely none. They don't want their civilians to own firearms. So when they talk about an international treaty to prevent small arms trafficking, what they're talking about is keeping civilians from owning firearms. So it should come as no surprise that that's what this treaty is aimed at. And it would have to be ratified by the Senate. Now, that's one thing that concerns me as well. Even though it have to go through the Senate, John Kerry has signed it. But think about this. I don't even think this is constitutional for us to sign into a treaty without it going through the House of Representatives. I know that's how treaties are entered, but this treaty would infringe on our Constitution. And so I don't think you can take away constitutional rights just by consulting one body of Congress without consulting the other. So, there's a litany of reasons that I believe we should pass H.R. 1205. We call it the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. And among other things, we say get the U.S. out of the UN, this bill would also get the UN out of the U.S. They've basically been free parking in New York City, and I don't mean just parking. I mean, they could run up tickets. They've got diplomatic immunity, and their headquarters is right there in New York. So this is where all the dictators come to congregate in our country to promulgate rules that would affect our citizens.
Now, I'm curious, we're talking with Congressman Thomas Massie. He has advanced Amexit, which is goal here is to remove the United States from the United Nations. What kind of reception, and we're very glad that our good friend, mutual friend, Jeff Duncan, is one of the people who signed on to this. What kind of reception have you received? This was introduced last year. How many others have signed on to this?
Well, we've got 7 co-sponsors. Mike Rogers from Alabama is the original sponsor of this. This bill was originally written by Ron Paul and introduced in 1997, and it's had as many as 50-plus co-sponsors in the past. So far, we've got 7 on this. Hopefully, all the attention given to the Brexit will help us raise the profile of this bill, which we're calling Amexit. And, this at times in the past, Congress has voted, or at least the administration has withheld funding to the United Nations. Now, they eventually paid it back, but by withholding funding, they were able to negotiate a lower fee for us to be a member of the United Nations. And and when it did get a vote in Congress a few years ago, it came just 70 votes short of cutting funding for the United Nations. And 70 votes is not a lot because, you've flipped 35 folks and it's passed out of 435 in the House. So I think there'll be more attention paid to it as time goes on. I think we're going to pick up some momentum. This was trending yesterday on Facebook, this issue, and the only way to move it forward is to get more co-sponsors in the House.
And this is basically one of the reasons I wanted you to come on this broadcast. So really, anybody within the sound of my voice, you need to call your member of Congress and say, hey, I want this piece of legislation advanced, and I want you as my congressperson to sign on to this. That's what they need to do, right?
Absolutely. That's how we move this bill forward. And just want to point out that if we were doing the appropriations process, if we could get to all 12 appropriations bills instead of doing an omnibus, and if Paul Ryan would allow us to offer amendments to the omnibus bill on the one that funds the State Department, we could actually offer this bill in an amendment form to defund the money that's going to the United Nations. So there are multiple legislative paths to get it there. Even if a member of the House or the Senate does not support this bill, the question, I think, that deserves a debate is how much should the United States pay the United Nations? And right now, it's on the order of $8 billion. And we're just one of 193 members in the United Nations, yet we're paying over a fifth of the bill for the United Nations. So even if you don't want to withdraw completely from the UN, how much is it worth, and how much should we keep paying for such dismal results?
And you've, I think, correctly pointed out, because of what's taking place with Brexit, perhaps this is a time where people have a heightened sense of awareness of concerns related to sovereignty and, for that matter, fiscal responsibility. And I think that's something it's very important going forward.
Well, I tell you, something that heightened my concern for sovereignty, and I don't want to conflate the World Trade Organization with the United Nations, but there's a similar issue here in that we have sliced off part of our sovereignty and given it to a multinational, supranational body, sort of like Britain did there with the EU for a while. We have given some of our constitutional authority to the World Trade Organization, and this became evident to me last year when the World Trade Organization came to Congress and said, you've got to remove your country of origin labels off the beef and pork that you sell in your supermarkets.
I remember that.
Yeah, that was a clear example. Again, that's not the United Nations. That's a World Trade Organization and a separate organization, supranational organization. But there's a clear instance of where yes, it's true. It still has to go through Congress to become effective, but it has the presumption of validity when the World Trade Organization comes back to Congress and says, you got to do this. And it's like, the WTO says jump and Congress says how high. And that's what happened with the food labeling. And so now when you go to the supermarket, there's no mandatory label on beef and pork of country of origin.
You have no idea where it's coming from. And you warned us about this last year. We're up against a hard deadline. In about 10 seconds, where do we stand on appropriations, Thomas?
Well, it's grinding down. I had a couple pro-gun amendments that I wanted to offer recently. What's happened is Paul Ryan has cracked down on the amendment process, unfortunately. And whereas he said he would be more open than Boehner, he's actually become more closed in this process. Also, the Democrats did a sit-in, and they're grinding down, taking away the time we have to pass appropriations bills. I'm afraid we're headed toward an omnibus. That would be a horrible thing. And I'm going to be fighting to get 12 appropriations bills done instead of a giant omnibus.
I'm there with you, man. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot for coming on. Great to talk with you again, Congressman Thomas Massie.
Thank you, and another shout-out to my friend Jeff Duncan for co-sponsoring H.R. 1205.
Big amen to that. Thanks very much.